I want you to picture a very specific spot on the map.
Um, Late 16th century, I assume.
Exactly, late 16th century, and you are the captain of a merchant ship. Probably a three-masted flute ship, if we want to keep it strictly historical.
Which we do.
Of course we do. So you are sailing into the Øresund. That is that narrow, really choppy strait of water separating Denmark and Sweden.
It is freezing.
Freezing. The sky is just this bleak gray. And up on the shore, you see the silhouette of Kronborg Castle looming over you. And you see cannons.
A lot of cannons. And
Yeah.
they're absolutely not just for show.
Right. You have zero choice here. You have to drop anchor, lower a boat, row to shore, and face the King of Denmark's customs officers. Because if you want to get your cargo from the North Sea into the Baltic, you are paying the toll.
Every single barrel, every sack of grain, every bolt of cloth has to be declared.
And for anyone studying history, that moment of sheer bureaucratic anxiety is kind of an absolute miracle.
It really is, because the Danes wrote everything down. They created what we call the sound toll registers.
The STR?
Right, the STR. It is arguably one of the most complete, continuous customs logs in human history.
It is basically the big data of the Renaissance. And today we are going to dive into a very specific slice of that data. We're looking at a study by Jean-Maurice Bizier.
Titled The Baltic Wine Trade 1563 to 1657, published in the Scandinavian Economic History Review.
But we aren't just going to sit here counting barrels.
No, we definitely are not doing that.
Good. So the mission for this deep dive is to use these registers to understand a massive shift in European culture and economics. What was Northern Europe drinking, who was shipping it, and how a group of very savvy Dutch merchants essentially hacked the French wine industry.
And it is totally a detective story, because as glorious as these registers are, they are also full of holes.
Lies, missing pages.
Oh, yeah. What the author actually calls administrative chaos. The registers are a goldmine, but a very messy one. We have changing definitions of wine, wars disrupting the flow, and captains who are incredibly creative at hiding their cargo to save a few coins.
We definitely love a good smuggling story, and we will get to the crimes. But first, let us establish the menu.
Setting the scene.
Right. If I am a wealthy merchant in Danzig, or, say, a noble in Stockholm in 1565, what am I actually pouring into my glass?
Well, if you start in the 1560s, the undisputed king of the table is Rhenish wine.
Rhenish, so wine coming from the Rhine Valley in Germany.
Correct. Vineyards between Cologne and Spires, but also down to Alsace and the Mosel. It was a light white wine.
Okay, nice crisp white.
Yeah. But here is the catch. If you were served a glass of 1560s Rhenish wine today, you probably would not even recognize it as wine.
Wait, why? Was it spoiled by the time it got there?
Not spoiled, no, but it was
just right.
exactly adjusted. People back then did not drink it pure. It was essentially used as a cocktail base.
A cocktail base?
Yeah, the records show huge amounts of honey and sugar being added to it, and then came the spices.
Like what?
Cinnamon, nutmeg, liquor.
So they were drinking this heavily spiced, sugary syrup. That sounds more like cough medicine. Or maybe a really heavy mulled wine rather than a Riesling.
It was just the taste of the time. It was incredibly popular in the mid-16th century. This wine would travel down the Rhine River to the Netherlands.
Usually to a market like Dordrecht, right?
Exactly, and then shipped north to the Baltic. In those early years, this Rhenish mixture was absolutely the dominant drink.
So we have this sweet, spiced German wine reigning supreme. But looking at the charts and the source material, that dominance does not last at all. It kind of falls off a cliff.
It really does. Taste shifted, of course, but it was mostly an economic shift. The rising star that pushes Rhenish wine out of the market is simply listed in the logs as French wine.
Just French. That feels incredibly vague for a customs log.
It is frustratingly generic. Sometimes they specify Poitou, but mostly it is just French.
But we do know what this was right.
We do. These were wines from the Atlantic coast of France. Places like Nantes, La Rochelle, Bordeaux.
Okay, Bordeaux. Now we are talking high class. Was this the birth of the luxury wine trade?
Actually, quite the opposite, and this is so crucial to understanding the whole trade dynamic. Originally, these coastal French white wines were considered commonplace.
Commonplace.
Yeah, they were thin, highly acidic, and generally not considered worth traveling for. They were basically local drinks for local peasants.
Hold on. So how does a commonplace acidic peasant wine displace the fancy spice Rhenish wine as the top export to the entire Baltic?
That is exactly where the Dutch come in. But hold that thought for just a second, because there is one more category on the menu we have to mention first.
Right. The southern wines.
The luxury tier. These are the wines that command the absolutely highest prices.
What are we talking about here?
You have Malmsey and Muscat, which are Greek or Mediterranean in origin.
Yeah.
Very sweet, heavy wines. You have the Spanish reds, like Alicante. You have Sack, which is what we would call sherry today.
And canary wine, right? I saw that praised in the notes.
Yes. Canary wine was highly praised by Saint Amand, very similar to Malmsey. And then you have a wine that appears constantly in the logs with a name that always catches people off guard. Bastard wine.
Bastard wine. I saw that. Is that a brand name or an insult?
It is a totally valid historical question. There is actually an ongoing debate among historians about what bastard even meant in this context.
What are the theories?
Some think it was just a specific type of sweet Spanish wine, but others argue the name implies it was a doctored wine.
A doctored wine.
Yeah, like a bastardization of different grapes or leftover vintages just mixed together.
So you might be paying top dollar for a total mystery blend.
Essentially, yes, but people happily paid it. In the 16th century, this southern category was the steady luxury trade. Malmsey and Muscat were for the upper classes.
Kind of occupying the same niche that port wine would take over later in the 18th century.
Exactly. It never had the massive volume of the French stuff, but it was a very consistent moneymaker.
Okay, so we have got the menu down. The declining spiced Rhenish, the rising generic French, and the high-end bastards and sherries. Now let's talk about the movers. The outline for this study calls this section the Dutch hegemony.
It is a strong word, but it is the only word that really fits here. The United Provinces, the Netherlands, were the absolute undisputed masters of this trade.
How dominant are we talking?
If you look at the entire period from 1563 to 1657, Dutch ships accounted for 60% of all wine transport through the Sound.
60%. That is basically a monopoly.
It effectively is. To give you some context, the next closest competitor was East Friesland, specifically the port of Emden, which had about 25%.
And Denmark.
Denmark, the country actually collecting the tolls and controlling the strait, only carried about 12%.
Wow. But the source material describes the Dutch role as a peaceful invasion. That implies they were doing a lot more than just driving the ships.
Oh, they were doing so much more. This is where the story gets surprisingly modern. The Dutch did not just show up at a French port, buy whatever was available, and leave.
What did they do?
They fundamentally restructured the French wine industry to suit their own business model.
How does that work in practice? Did they buy the vineyards?
They physically moved in. Dutch merchants settled in French coastal towns like Nantes and Bordeaux.
Yeah.
And they became burgesses.
Meaning they got citizenship rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which allowed them to completely bypass the local French middlemen and deal directly with the actual vine growers.
So they cut out the middleman. That is vertical integration in the 16th century.
Absolutely. And they brought financial tools that the French growers had literally never seen before. The Dutch would buy the crops before the vintage harvest even happened.
Wait, futures trading? They were buying wine futures?
Effectively, yes. They would pay cash up front for grapes that had not even been picked yet. This gave them enormous leverage over the local economy.
Because they controlled the cash flow.
Right. And because the Dutch demand was so incredibly high, and they were so obsessed with efficiency, they started telling the French farmers exactly what to grow.
They changed the biology of the vineyards.
They really did. The Dutch wanted quantity, and they wanted it cheap. And most importantly, they wanted it near the water to minimize their transport costs.
So what did they force the growers to do?
They encouraged French growers to literally rip out their old vines and plant heavy-yielding, high-output vines right on the coast.
Even if the wine tasted significantly worse.
They did not care about the taste anywhere near as much as they cared about the volume and the price. They subsidized the vine growers to prioritize these high-yield vines over the better quality inland wines.
Because the inland ones would cost more to transport over land to the ships.
Exactly. It was purely a logistics calculation.
So they basically turned traditional winemaking into a factory production line.
That is a very fair assessment. But there was a major biological problem with this plan. This new coastal wine produced from these high-yield grapes was incredibly thin.
Thin, meaning low alcohol content.
Right. And that meant it ran a huge risk of turning into vinegar during the long sea voyage up to the Baltic.
Oh, right. Because without enough alcohol to act as a preservative, weak wine just goes bad in a ship's hold. So how did they solve that?
They innovated. To save the cargo, they started fortifying the wine. They would add spirits or syrup to boost the alcohol content so it would actually survive the trip north.
But to get that spirit, they had to get it from somewhere.
They had to distill excess wine.
Wait, Are you telling me that the Dutch obsession with shipping logistics actually kickstarted the French brandy industry?
In a lot of ways, yes. The source specifically notes that this drive to use up excess production and stabilize the product for transport was a major catalyst for the distillation of brandy.
That is wild.
It was not about culinary excellence or making a fine after-dinner drink. It was strictly about shipping efficiency. Condensed wine takes up less space and does not rot on a boat.
We think of brandy as this refined luxury spirit, but it literally started as a way to compress cargo for the Dutch.
It is the industrialization of alcohol, and it completely explains why the French wine category exploded in the registers. It was a product specifically engineered by the Dutch for the northern export market.
Okay, but surely this massive Dutch machine could not run perfectly forever. You mentioned East Friesland earlier, specifically the port of Emden.
The Emden Interlude.
Right, Emden is just over the border in Germany. Why does it suddenly pop up out of nowhere in the data?
This is a perfect example of how sensitive these trade routes are to geopolitics. In 1568, the Dutch revolt against Spain begins.
The 80 Years' War.
Exactly. The Low Countries are thrown into absolute chaos, political disorders, military campaigns.
So the Dutch ships just cannot sail safely.
Right, or it is just way too dangerous to do business. Around 1569, the volume of wine carried in Dutch bottoms absolutely collapses. It falls off a cliff.
But the people in the Baltic are still thirsty. The demand does not just disappear.
It does not.
Yeah.
So who steps in to fill the void? Emden.
Why Emden specifically?
Because that is exactly where the Dutch went. Thousands of Dutch refugees, including merchants, financiers, and ship captains, fled the violence and just set up shop in Emden.
They took their expertise, their contacts, and their ships right across the border.
Yes. So between 1583 and 1600, Emden briefly becomes this massive wine capital of the north.
Carrying a huge chunk of the traffic.
They carried over half the Rhenish traffic during that window.
So it is really still the Dutch trade network, just flying a different flag at convenience to avoid the war.
Precisely. It shows just how incredibly resilient this merchant class was. But it was temporary.
What happened when the war cooled down?
As soon as the Dutch Republic stabilized, the trade shifted right back to Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and Emden just faded back into insignificance.
It is like squeezing a balloon. You push the Dutch out of Holland, they just pop up in Germany.
Exactly.
Now I want to look at the timeline of these trends again. We have this big shift from Rhenish to French wine. But looking at the data in the study, there is a really weird anomaly.
You are talking about the explosion of 1618.
Yes. From 1574 to 1617, the growth is pretty steady. A mix of wines, French is growing. But then suddenly, between 1618 and 1629, the volume of wine recorded in the registers just skyrockets.
Especially for French wine. In years like 1623, 1624, 1626, it is off the charts.
My first thought reading that was, did the start of the 30 Years' War just make everyone incredibly thirsty? Was this armies buying up all the booze?
That is a very logical historical guess, but the answer is actually much more bureaucratic. This brings us back to the whole data detective theme.
Okay.
That massive jump in the graph almost certainly is not a jump in actual drinking. It is a jump in honesty.
Honesty.
Or rather, the forced enforcement of honesty. We have to talk about the salt trick.
Oh, I love this part. Break down the salt trick for us.
Okay, so imagine you are a Dutch captain in, say, 1610. Prior to 1618, customs control at the Sound was notoriously loose.
Sloppy inspections.
Very sloppy. You have a ship with a large deep hold. What you do is you fill the bottom floor with barrels of very expensive French wine. But then you pile tons and tons of bulk salt right on top of it.
Because salt is cheap, it is heavy, and it is messy.
Exactly. And the toll you had to pay for bulk salt was very low. So you arrive at the Sound. The Danish customs officer comes aboard, opens the hatch, and looks in the hold.
And all he sees is a giant mountain of salt.
Right. He is not going to ask his men to shovel 10 tons of dirty salt just to check the bottom floor of the ship. So you declare the salt, you pay the cheap toll, and you conveniently forget to mention the pipes of wine hidden underneath.
And the wine goes through completely tax-free. That is brilliant.
It was a massive scam. And since salt was a huge import to the Baltic anyway because they needed it for preserving herring, this happened thousands of times.
So individually small amounts of smuggling, but scaled up massively.
Yes. The source strongly suggests that prior to 1618, the official records are massively undercounting the true early trade volume because so much wine was literally hidden under salt.
So what changed in 1618? Did the Danish inspectors suddenly get X-ray vision?
They got a completely new administration. A major customs reform was enacted in 1618. The Danish king tightened the screws, inspection became rigorous, and the loopholes were closed.
So that massive explosion of wine in the data wasn't actually new wine flowing in.
No, it was just the existing wine finally being counted.
Wow.
It reveals that the golden age of the trade had actually started much earlier, but it was just completely invisible to the taxman. It is a great lesson in why you cannot trust historical data blindly. A spike on a graph might just mean better paperwork.
And what about the luxury southern wines during this time? Did they boom too?
They remained a smaller, steady trade. They actually peaked at about 3,800 pipes around 1623.
But then they crashed. Right.
They did crash in the late 1620s,
Oh.
but that was a supply issue due to problems getting shipments out of Spain, Portugal, and the Mediterranean, rather than a lack of demand.
Speaking of the Mediterranean, before we move to the final assessment, I have one huge question about the players here. We have the Dutch, the Germans, the Danes. Where are the English?
It is the elephant in the room.
Right. We always hear about England as this great rising maritime power during this era. Surely they were shipping wine up to the Baltic.
You would absolutely think so, but in this specific data set, they are almost ghosts. The English played a tiny, tiny role.
How tiny.
They accounted for only about 5% of the southern wine trade and almost none of the French trade.
That just seems wrong.
Yeah.
Were they just completely outmatched by the Dutch?
Not outmatched, they just had different ambitions. The Dutch were the absolute masters of the carrying trade, moving bulk goods between European ports. The English, by this time, were looking much further afield.
So they were skipping the Baltic entirely.
Mostly, yes. They were sailing directly down to the Mediterranean itself, to Italy, to Turkey, and eventually focusing on the Americas.
So the Baltic wine route was just too small time for them.
It was a secondary market in their eyes. The English preferred to go straight to the source. They did not want to haul cheap French wine to Danzig. They wanted to haul silk and high-end spices from the Levant directly to London.
Okay, so step back for a second. We have this picture of a bustling, complex trade network. Dutch supply chain managers, French industrial vineyards being planted on demand, smuggling captains hiding cargo, rigorous Danish tax collectors. It really feels like a massive, sophisticated global system.
It does feel that way. And this is exactly where the author, Bizier, drops the hammer. He ends the study with a section that is essentially a giant reality check.
Give it to us. So what filter? How big was this trade really in the grand scheme of things?
Well, let us look at the raw numbers. We can actually compare the Baltic trade to the exports of a single French city, La Rochelle, because we have their tax records too. Innkeepers there had to pay to sell wine.
Okay, so we know exactly what they produced.
Right. And the total amount of French wine sent through the Sound to the entire Baltic region was only about 22% of La Rochelle's exports.
Wait, the entire Baltic consumption was just 22% of what one single French city was shipping out.
Yes, and arguably a totally insignificant amount compared to their total overall production.
That puts it in perspective.
But the comparison gets even more brutal when you look at the Dutch domestic market. We know the Dutch were importing massive amounts of wine for themselves.
For their own taverns and homes.
Exactly. In 1550, the Low Countries imported roughly 38,000 barrels of wine for domestic consumption.
38,000 barrels.
Now compare that to the Sound toll registers. In those early years, the amount of wine passing through to the Baltic was rarely more than 500 barrels.
500 versus 38,000.
It is a rounding error.
That is barely even a sideshow.
Even in the absolute peak, years later on, the entire Baltic market represented less than a third of the wine imported into just 3 Dutch provinces during a civil war.
Wow.
The source literally uses the word insignificant to describe the Baltic wine trade compared to the consumption happening in the Netherlands.
I have to admit that feels a little anticlimactic. Have we really just spent all this time dissecting a trade network that did not even matter?
No, and this is the vital takeaway from the study. It did not matter in terms of sheer volume compared to the Dutch home market, but it matters immensely to history.
Because of the documentation.
Exactly, because we have the data. The massive internal trade happening inside the Netherlands was not recorded in the same centralized, detailed way.
The Sound toll registers act like a magnifying glass.
Perfectly said. Because of that specific choke point, because every ship had to stop and pay that toll to the Danish king, We can clearly see the underlying mechanisms of the trade.
We can track the smuggling under the salt.
We can see the shift from Rhenish to French wine. We can map the origin points. We can see the whole peaceful invasion of the French coast happening in the numbers in a way we just cannot see anywhere else.
So it is a microcosm. The Baltic trade might have been incredibly small in volume, but it shows us exactly how the massive Dutch economic engine actually worked.
Precisely. We can literally see the gears of early modern capitalism turning. If we only looked at the big overall volume numbers, we would miss all the intricate details of how the trade was actually conducted.
It is a great reminder that sometimes the biggest historical lessons come from the smallest data sets. Just because it was, a petty trade doesn't mean it was not incredibly sophisticated.
Petty is actually the exact word the historian Lucien Febvre used when looking at this. He described this entire Baltic operation as merely petty food transport.
Ouch. Petty food transport. That really strips the romance right out of the Age of Sail.
It does. But he also gave it a wonderfully beautiful image. He described these small merchant boats dragging their big bellies under the misty skies.
Big bellies under the misty skies. That is incredibly evocative.
It reminds us that behind all the dry spreadsheets, the bureaucracy, and the clever customs fraud, these were just wooden boats.
Bobbing around in the freezing cold water.
Right. Keeping the people of the North connected to the warmth and the vineyards of the South. It might have been a small petty trade on paper. It might have just been grocery getting for a minor market. But for the person drinking that glass of spiced wine in Stockholm, it was everything.
And I think that is the perfect, provocative thought to leave you with today. A toast to the big bellies, the administrative chaos, and the smugglers who kept the wine flowing. Thank you for walking us through this incredible data set.
It was my absolute pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. We will catch you on the next deep dive.